Hi everyone, it's me, Arielle, and it's Wednesday Warriors. And this week we're going to be talking about recognizing triggers, what they are, how they manifest, what the word trigger really means, and obviously looking at these issues in regards to eating disorders. I've definitely done some videos about triggers in the past, specifically support groups and triggers, friends and triggers, and just triggers in general, and those were all separate videos. I also did a video called Recovery Roadblocks, that's fairly old by now, but it deals with things of a triggering aspect. I also did a separate video called Triggers and Pro-Ana, where I talked about both things and how Pro-Ana is a trigger. I also did a video back in 2009 called Pressures and Triggers, and it was a two-part video, and I covered a lot of things in that video, so if you think that would be helpful, I'm going to post the links to all of the videos that I've done that deal with triggers. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into what a trigger is, what it means, and why I think that it's not a good idea to really just avoid triggers, because it may seem in the short term to make your life simpler, but really what it's doing is causing you to not really get better. You are just avoiding certain things that can be a problem. And what you have to realize is that life can be triggering, and leading a real or quote-unquote normal life can have triggers in it. So the sooner you learn to deal with those things, the better off you're going to be and the healthier you're going to be. Next week, I'm going to be looking at recognizing whether you're deliberately exposing yourself to triggers, and if you are, why that is, and why people may ignore trigger warnings or continue to be in toxic relationships or do things that are toxic to them. So I'm going to specifically just deal with what triggers are and recognizing them and how they may play a role in your life and in your recovery. Make the distinction that triggers are different than toxic relationships or toxic things. There are many things that are bad for us that we should avoid, that we shouldn't put ourselves in the middle of, and that are always going to be things that we are better without. And then there are things that are triggers, and these triggers can relate to food, they can relate to weight, they can relate to other people or situations, and some things are just ever present in our life, and we need to figure out how to cope with those things healthfully and how to understand why they trigger us so that we can get better and move on. A trigger is usually something that makes you want to turn to your eating disorder or turn to unhealthy behaviors. A trigger is something that triggers you into feeling terrible about yourself or triggers you into using a certain eating disorder behavior. That's typically what is meant by the word trigger. And as I said a little bit earlier, a trigger can have to do with food. If you are a binge eater or you have bulimia, just for example, maybe eating a certain kind of candy is a food that triggers you. And because of that, if you eat that food or if you see that food or if you eat one piece of that food, you're automatically going to be triggered into eating all of it, which constitutes as a binge, and then purging to get rid of it. So in that case, in that instance, a certain food might be a trigger for you to fall into your eating disorder behavior, almost as though you can't help yourself. This is a trigger. It's not a toxic thing. And so the way you can look at it to see the difference is candy or a piece of candy is not toxic. It should not be toxic in the life of a person who is healthy. Because it triggers certain emotions and behaviors in you and causes you to turn to your eating disorder, it is a trigger. It's not a toxic item. So I hope that makes sense and sort of shows the difference. And because it's not something that's toxic but is a trigger, it's really better if you can learn to deal with the trigger and understand it and recognize why it's happening instead of just avoiding it completely and never looking at that kind of food ever again. In the short term, it may be a good idea to avoid certain foods that cause a binge or cause you to want to purge if you're trying to get a handle on yourself and your eating disorder and get a stronger foothold in recovery and help yourself mentally and physically get well. There's nothing wrong with sort of altering certain things in order to make behaviors stop or become less. But you have to realize that if you're going to spend the rest of your life decades upon decades avoiding one particular food just because it may trigger a binge or trigger a purge or something like that, you haven't really dealt with the issue. You still have a problem, and the only reason you aren't turning to behaviors is because you're not allowing yourself to come in contact with that food. So really, the issue hasn't been dealt with and you're not quote unquote healed. That's what I mean by how avoiding triggers isn't necessarily the way to go. Avoiding them short term may be good, but avoiding them for the rest of your life isn't really the answer. If you can think of something that's a food, for example, being a trigger to you, you're really allowing an inanimate object to have control over you. You're giving all of the power to that silly thing, and you're relinquishing your power to it. Sort of the same thing with a scale. A lot of people give the scale a lot of power. The scale dictates their mood, it dictates their day, it makes them feel bad, it makes them feel good, depending on what that number is. It's an inanimate object on the floor, and people give it a lot of power. And they think and feel a lot of the time that they're in control, but really they're not in control. It's sort of a tricky thing, and a scale can definitely be a trigger as well. There are other triggers, like family members specifically, and it's important to ask yourself whether the family member in question is a trigger or is toxic. And the way you can figure that out is if that person really is no good to have in your life, or if something about them just triggers you into eating disorder thoughts or behaviors because of another aspect. And I'll give you an example. If you are triggered by your father because he is abusive and mean, he is a toxic entity in your life. He is a trigger also, but he's toxic, meaning maybe he doesn't have a place in your life for you to be healthy, for you to be in recovery. If you have, let's say, an aunt who is triggering to you because she's very thin, then she's not really toxic. She is a trigger to you, and that is because you have an issue with that you have to deal with, whether it's jealousy or whether it brings up certain emotions or certain memories or just reminds you of comparisons. She might be a delightful person and is therefore not toxic in your life, and there is a place for her, but you have to deal with some things within you. And she's just then a trigger. She's not toxic. So to completely avoid her, you're not dealing with your problem. And that is why avoiding triggers isn't good, but avoiding toxic people or things is good. I think it helps to share these examples and really ask yourself these questions, because sometimes all it takes is a simple question to yourself. And maybe you need to write it down, maybe you just need to ask yourself in your own head, is this person or is this thing or is this situation toxic or triggering? And obviously if something's toxic, it probably is also triggering. But some things are only triggering and some things are toxic and triggering. So if you can figure out which it is, you will be better able to deal with it and better able to choose your course of action and be more in control and understand if the issue lies with you and things you need to work on in recovery, or if it lies with that thing or that person. Something to try if you don't even know what it is that is triggering you, which is an issue for many people. They realize that they've been triggered. They may turn to eating disordered thoughts or eating disordered behaviors, but they don't know exactly what set them off. Something to try might be charting some things. And I'm just going to explain that by reading a little bit of a post that I wrote way back in 2009 in response to a reader question. Someone asked, how do you react when you feel hate for yourself and or your body? What do you do when you feel overwhelmed instead of hurting yourself or restricting? And you could insert binging, purging, any other kind of eating disorder behavior or self-harm in there. My answer is going to be the same. And my answer was this: As a woman who loves her body now, or at least likes it most of the time, trust me when I say that you can, in fact, learn to stop hating yourself and your body. This is one of the main things people struggling with eating disorders, especially those who are women, think is impossible. What I hear a lot is, it may be possible, but not for me. Let me tell you, cut that way of thinking right out of your brain. Carve it out of there and throw it away. It is possible for you if you let it be possible. And if you realize that you may have to garner an extreme amount of patience in order to wait for this sort of self-hate to dissipate. Are you with me? First thing you need to ask yourself is, what are the circumstances surrounding my feelings of hate for myself and or my body? Did you just discover you'd been rejected in some way by a person, a program, etc.? Were you unsuccessful in an endeavor you had hoped to master or finish? Did you just eat, whether it was too much or too little? Did you just weigh yourself and not like the number? Did you just attempt for a long time to choose clothing to wear and were still unsatisfied with the choice you made? Did you just endure a hurtful, stressful, uncomfortable time with family or friends? These are just a few of the circumstances that can play a part in how you're feeling about yourself. They affect why you react the way you do to yourself and the way you look, if body image is an issue that you have. You have to pose those questions to yourself in order to analyze what you're feeling. You know how people chart anything and everything these days? Their menstrual cycle, their meals, their ovulation, their money spent. Well, chart your self-hate. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that you self-hate all the time, so how can you chart it? Well, look at this question that I just answered. It's obvious that even if you don't generally like yourself, you feel particular instances of self-hate or body hatred that make you want to restrict or binge or purge or cut, etc. It's these times to which I'm referring. You're also probably thinking, wow, Arielle just told me to chart my self-hate. What the hell? But think about it. If you keep a journal page or a chart specifically to record each time you feel the urge to restrict or purge or self-harm in some way, you'll begin to see the patterns. You'll begin to realize what it's all about. You learned about cause and effect in school, and this is it. You already know the effect, your body hatred and the behavior of choice. It's time to figure out the cause. So mark it down. Mark down the date, the time, what you're feeling, and what just happened in your day. You'll begin to see a clearer picture of what's going on. You may also begin to see that you tend to feel worse on a particular day of the week because of something, or during a particular time in your cycle, or on days that you see a certain person. These are good things to discover because you'll learn to be more aware and more prepared and more ready to combat them. You will know from the moment you wake up on a given day that it's probably going to be a hard day for you, for whatever reason, based on your chart. And you can give yourself extra boosts of encouragement, have a plan already in place for what to do if you feel the urge to act on a behavior, and above all, not be caught off guard when that self-hate starts to rage inside of you. Another question you might want to ask yourself is jealousy, envy, comparison part of my feelings of this self-hate or body hatred? For example, did you just watch a TV show, movie, commercial that made you feel badly about yourself? That triggered you? That caused you to compare yourself to the person or people? Did you spend the day with a friend you envy? Does being with this friend make you feel badly about yourself? Do you feel not sick enough, not thin enough, not pretty enough based on something you saw or something someone said? The last question you might want to ask yourself is, does this time of year affect me more than others? Many people have seasonal depression or even just feel less comfortable during particular months of the year. Summer can be a trigger for people who constantly worry about being seen in less clothing like tank tops or bathing suits, or because they continue to see other people in tank tops or bathing suits, which causes them to get down on themselves or wish they looked different. Certain months of the year can be a trigger for people because of holidays, like an impending Thanksgiving with food and family, or the month of December because of Christmas, Hanukkah, etc., or even the New Year, because it often causes people to reflect and berate themselves or make unhealthy resolutions. Awareness is key. So what do you do when you feel overwhelmed instead of hurting yourself? You make a plan B. That way, when the urge happens, you have options at your fingertips and you don't have to rely on an overwhelmed mind. I hope you have a great week, everyone, and I'll see you next time.